Welcome to the NLI USA Signature Speaker Series. I'm Adina Canefield, the CEO of NLI USA. As many of you know by now, the Speaker Series is designed to highlight the mission of the library as an intellectual and cultural center, and to do so in a way that reflects contemporary issues of our time. With that in mind, I am delighted to present to you our program for today, The Language of War, Lost in Translation. We bring this event to you in partnership with the Sammy Rohr Prize Writers Showcase. We are thrilled to be working together to advance the literary field and to recognize the great Jewish authors of our day. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador Michael Oren, one of those great Jewish authors and thought leaders who will be our interlocutor today. Michael Oren served as Israel's ambassador to the United States, as a member of Knesset, and as Deputy Minister of Diplomacy in the Prime Minister's office. Among his many honors, he is a New York Times bestselling author. He was named by Politico as one of the 50 most influential thinkers in America, by the Forward as one of the 5 most influential Jews in America, and by the Jerusalem Post as one of the 10 most influential Jews worldwide. He has taught at Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown, and in recent years, Michael has devoted time to his passion for writing fiction. Michael is truly in a unique position to address the current challenges and questions facing Jewish writers today. As you enjoy the program, I want to invite you to pose questions in the chat function, and those questions will be addressed at the end of the program. Now I'm privileged to introduce to you Deborah Goldberg, the director of the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. Deborah?
Thank you, Adina. On behalf of the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, I first want to express appreciation for our collaboration, the National Library of Israel. This is an exciting time for us. We recently announced this year's finalists for the prize in nonfiction, and within the next few weeks, we will be announcing the winner. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, all of whom are award-winning authors and fellows of the Sammy Rohr Jewish Literary Institute. Elisa Albert is the author of the novels Human Blues, The Book of Dahlia, the short story collection How This Night is Different, and the forthcoming essay collection, The Snarling Girl. Iddo Gefen is the author of the short story collection Jerusalem Beach and the novel Mrs. Lillian Bloom's Cloud Factory. He was an NLI Pardes Fellow and is currently pursuing a PhD in cognitive psychology at Columbia University. Aviya Kushner is the Forward's language columnist and the author of Wolf, Lamb, Bomb, and the Grammar of God. She is an associate professor at Columbia College Chicago, where she directs the MFA program in creative writing. And with that, I turn the proceedings over to Ambassador Oren.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Adina. Thank you all. This is always an extreme pleasure and delight to be associated with and appear in a special broadcast of the National Library of Israel. A special honor and privilege to be associated in any way with the Rohr Prize and the extraordinary Rohr family. And I've had, again, the honor, not to belabor the term, to know the Rohrs, including Sammy Rohr, for many years. And you do an extraordinary service to the Jewish people and certainly to Jewish literature in giving this prize to such just truly uniquely talented young Jewish authors. So tonight, what a little bit of a challenge here. We have 3 very different books written by different authors in different places in the world. We have The Grammar of God. I hold this up, by Aviya Kushner. It is we'll get a chance to talk about it, but it is a book, I got to tell you, Aviya, that has changed the way I read the Bible. I don't think I ever read the Bible the same again, and I read the Bible every week, of course, in my Kehillah here, and just the way you cannot, you see what's lost in translation when you try to translate the Bible into other languages. But it's not just that; it's the way you weave in your personal story, which is so moving. I was deeply moved by your personal story. Iddo Gefen's book, Jerusalem Beach, which is interesting because here's a book was written in Hebrew, obviously translated with, I don't know, I actually don't know how a non-Israeli reads this book because it is, as you've probably been heard many times, and forgive me for saying this, it's Edgar Carrot meets Kafka meets a Geshasha Chivero or Eretz Nehederet. Okay, because who else is going to know who Daphne Leaf is and Ehud Benai is and Carmela Menashe? All right, who knows who Carmela Menashe is? Okay, and it's an intensely Israeli book, which again I couldn't put down. And then Elisa's book, which I have online here, if I can get my iPad to work, you'll see right here is the Book of Dahlia. And again, this is a work of fiction. It is, what we're going to say, Fear of Flying meets Portnoy's Complaint meets the death of Ivan Ilyich. Okay, well, I hope you take that in the right spirit. About a young woman who's come down, very young woman, coming down with cancer, and it's about the story of her, the last months of her life, which is deep investigation of her psyche, of her challenges in life, of dealing with life and death, of immense issues you're dealing with in this book. And again, a book that you cannot read without literally having your breath taken away by reading it. So it was great. And then I've also had the privilege of being able to look at some of your articles you've written since the war has broken out. And so the first question I have to ask you, first of all, in that alien world that we know as October 6th, a completely alien world, what did we, as writers of fiction and nonfiction, Israelis, American Jews, what did we have in common? Did we have a common language? Did we share a common worldview of Weltanschauung? On what level could we interact and relate to one another? And please, I'm not going to call on anybody, just, be Jewish and barge in.
Seems like so long ago. Seems like another
Wasn't it?
It's hard to get back into that headspace.
Yeah.
We were so innocent, but we weren't really. I think we knew that we had problems. I don't think anybody thought everything was hunky-dory. And yet we were fine. Everything was ho-hum.
I seem to recall the streets here on fire over a certain judicial reform program of the government.
Right.
And it almost seems quaint at this point, right? It almost seems innocent. We were innocent back then. What did we know that moment before dawn on October 7th? What did we know? And what do we have in common before then? Before we've talked about what life is like since October 7th as writers. Aviya?
I do think that there was a lot that connected the Jewish community beforehand, especially when you think about the Tanakh as a connector, right? The Torah itself and Jewish literature. I think that was a connector that we had before. But I also think that there was a growing distance between the American Jewish community and Israel by October 6th. And I think some of that is language. I think it's a huge tragedy that Hebrew hasn't really been emphasized in the Jewish community in the United States. So I think being able to listen to the news in Hebrew and understand it is a game changer. And I think that that's something that has contributed to the divide. But I think so I would say there was maybe some connection between the religious communities of Israel and the US. But I think in the, let's say, non-Orthodox community, I think there was a growing distance before October 7th.
Yeah, I totally agree with Aviya. And I have to admit, I'm Israeli, as you mentioned, and I moved to New York about 2 years ago. And I have to say that I felt like a lot of Israelis, when you're in Israel, I think in a sense you think, there is no difference between being Israeli and being Jewish abroad. And just moving here, and first of all, just getting to know the food, the New York Jewish food, which is amazing, and you can find the same good restaurants. But in a larger sense, I think I have to admit myself, I wasn't aware of a lot of the conflicts and things that Jewish people in the dystopia are dealing with, are thinking about. And for me, moving in general to New York changed that perception, but I think even more since October 7, understanding a lot about the differences. It's something that I'm just thinking about constantly. And I think it also, in a sense, shaped my identity in a new way. Like
Mm,
now more than ever, I feel not only
Mhm.
Israeli, but also Jewish.
wow.
Mm.
Wow.
I think that feeling has been compounded. It's something I deal with very frequently here because Israelis see a completely different news than what you see in America. Completely different.
Mhm.
You know, American news now is pretty much 24/7 Palestinian suffering.
Mhm.
Israeli news is Jewish suffering and Jewish heroism.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so the reality outside of the same of Israel is completely incompatible with the
Mhm.
reality that we're experiencing here.
Mhm.
And even explaining to Israelis what that reality outside is very difficult.
Iddo, did you use the word dystopian instead of diaspora?
Yeah, sorry.
It's
Yeah.
hilarious.
That
was good.
so it
Yes.
is, like in a sense, maybe it's
That's good.
Freud would have something to say about it.
And then, you know,
Yeah.
I was reading your articles, your responses to the war are very different too, because Aviya has a
Mhm.
spiritual response to the war. How do we speak it? What language do we use when we talk about hostages? Do we
Right.
free the hostages?
Right.
Do we release the hostages? Or do
Right.
we redeem the hostages? Because the word redeem, of course, is endowed with deep spiritual ramifications.
Yes.
Redemption.
Yes.
It's even different words in Hebrew, right? Pidyon,
Right.
shuim.
Right.
And if you could talk about that,
Right.
maybe we'll talk about different reactions to the war.
Sure. No, I really noticed that. I was noticing that in American news coverage, sometimes the language being used for the hostages actually made Hamas look fantastic. You know, like generous Hamas is freeing the hostage. You know, that sort of thing, as if, you know, out of the goodness of their hearts. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I realized that piece started with a tip from someone who used to be a correspondent in Israel and isn't anymore, and she's married to an Israeli, and her Israeli husband was sort of shocked by the press releases coming out of Israel's government office describing the hostage situation, and said, you know, he thinks this is a mistranslation. What do you think? So I looked into it, and I realized that some of the language that the government office is using is coming from translations of the Tanakh. It's intentionally religious language, right? And so that's very interesting. And it speaks, I think, not just to the Jewish community, but to the Christian community. So I thought that was an interesting call. But I think, to my mind, the more dangerous situation is the verbs used for that make Hamas look wonderful. And that's something that I guess scares me less than the religious languages, is that sort of you know, magnanimous Hamas language that can come through in headlines. Michael, I did want to just add to your point earlier about the different news. I do watch Israeli news on television. Something that I have noticed is that Israeli news has a lot of coverage of the people who've been the 170,000 Israelis who have been evacuated from their homes, right? And that almost never covered in the English language news media. And it's a huge point, you know, to have a significant percentage of the population of Israel that can't go home, right? And so American news coverage, by contrast, is almost entirely about the suffering of Gazan civilians. So that's the focus.
True.
So
And
it's
about a
just
quarter of our
interesting to
news every
see that.
night, a quarter of our news
Yeah.
every night is the story of the soldier that's been killed that day. Literally.
Right. That's right.
That's
That's
the
right.
lead story
That's
almost
right.
every night.
That's right. That's right.
And that is not reported anywhere. You know, our
That's
soldiers
right.
doesn't amount to anything. But I was just saying that one of the headlines that always gets me is when they talk about the possibility of redeeming hostages and
Yes.
freeing Palestinian prisoners, it's referred
Yes.
to as a hostage exchange.
Mhm.
And that gets you. The hostage exchange. Lisa, what do you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will add that something that really caught my eye was in the discussion of the Wall Street Journal reporter who's been in prison for a year due to Putin, right? I noticed that It was on the PBS NewsHour, and I believe it was the editor of the Wall Street Journal was asked, "Do you consider this a hostage situation?" He said yes. So I thought that was interesting, that can be framed as a hostage situation as well. But yeah, it's all how you describe it, right? Are they exchanges, or are they all the same situation? It's all in the
Gotcha.
language. Yeah.
Gotcha. Lisa, we're gonna say?
Narratives. I mean, we're talking about narratives. Language creates narrative, and narrative has a life of its own. Narrative takes on, unpredictable forms then, and we lose control of the narrative.
Have we?
And
Have we?
it's,
Yeah.
I function as a writer on a very like gut emotional level. That's my starting point. So I see and have seen my role since the war broke out as just trying to pay very close attention, listening very hard, and taking note of what I see in my communities, my various American secular diasporic communities, deeply betrayed and angry.
Came across in your article. Yeah.
Yeah, big time. And I've tried to. I wrote that one piece for Tablet, and it came out of a 3 a.m. sort of thumbs flying actual response to some Hudson Valley aesthete in my DMs, talking out of their butthole, if you'll pardon my language. And just this kind of like seeing a tidal wave of this kind of mercenary energy, this far-flung, opinionated, uninformed obsession, blood libel, and how it evolves. I mean, I never imagined in my life. My elder brother said something that keeps haunting me. We've had the luckiest lifetimes in Jewish history up till now, and like it's over,
There was Frank Foyer's
so
article in the
rage.
Atlantic. That was it was interesting because I actually worked with Frank for a long time at the New Republic, and he has that one section where he says, "Listen, I'm against occupation. I'm against settlers. I'm against." He goes all the things that I'm against. I.e., I'm the good Jew, and they're still coming after me. And that seems to be a refrain among parts of sort of the American Jewish intelligentsia, if you will. People who are
Wild out there.
sort of left of center and feel so deeply betrayed.
Yeah. And I just want to add about the idea of like different news that I can just share a perspective from the world of cognitive neuroscience. There's an amazing paper that came out that people listen to the same story by J.D. Salinger, and it's exactly the same story, and it's about a man that suspects that his wife is cheating on him. And one group just had the information in the beginning, he's wrong, and another group had the information, he's right. And afterwards, when they took the people to the scanner, they saw that the two groups had completely different neural systems operating and activated. And that's amazing that so little information can change completely the way we perceive the world. So just imagine the amount of information we have that really shifts the way we see the world in a different way. And I can just say personally, you asked about our response. I have to say I was completely depressed and devastated in the most personal sense. Unfortunately, my best friend was killed on October 7th.
I read this article. It's very disturbing, very moving article.
Yes, his name was Sagi Golan, and he was in the reserves, and he was one of the first soldiers to get to Be'eri, and he was killed while saving people in Be'eri. He managed to save a few families, and there's even people who met the family afterwards and told his story. And I have to say, for me, I was supposed to fly for his wedding a few days later, and I flew for his funeral, and I was just devastated the month after. And also, I'm here in Columbia University. As you all know, it's not the quietest place to be right now, and not as being Jewish. And I have to say, I was just so embedded in my own grief and feelings that I even at first, in a sense, wasn't aware of everything that's happening because I was so in my own story. And I think, again, that's also a bit of the gap between being an Israeli and being an American Jew, in the sense that there's different levels and layers that everybody share. And then again, you have these other angles of the experience.
And now we come to the hard question. It's no longer October 6th, it's now October 7th. And whenever I speak to American Jewish groups, I always say, I ask what date it is, and it's, January, it's February, it's March. I said, in Israel, it's still October 7th. We haven't moved beyond October 7th. But we as writers, fiction and nonfiction, what changes? How is our writing impacted by this? And then the really hard question, is writing possible right now? A personal perspective, I'm finishing up, I was about to finish up the collection of short stories. And I feel I not only cannot finish it, I think it would almost be distasteful to publish fiction at this point. But tell me what you think.
Well, I could tell you that October 6th, I was happily working on a novella about a menopausal woman, a day in the life, dealing with a adult child who's having a gender transition moment. I was like fine working on this book. I liked it. I was happy with it. It was fine. And it became instantly irrelevant. I could not care less.
I know it. Yeah.
In the metaphorical garbage. And I've been furiously, keyword, writing something since October 7th that I guess I'll call autofiction. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter to me. It's like there's no craft involved. I'm just trying to get down everything I need to get down.
So what is that? What are you trying to get down?
Well, it starts October 1st, heading to Tel Aviv with my 80-year-old mom to see the Codex Sassoon installed in the Ani Museum, and to have this beautiful trip that, probably is not going to happen again for a long time because of where we are in our lives. And just feeling, sitting in different Sukkot for days and thinking, my God, like, why don't I just change my life radically and be here? This is the only place I've ever really wanted to be. And it's magnificent. And my bones rattle here in a way that I can't explain to outsiders. And then it, the narrative continues on through the fallout and the aftermath. And, it wasn't until I got home to New York, October 14th, that I really started to be afraid. And I keep saying I felt safer in Israel October 8th than anywhere else. I mean,
we all did. It's so bizarre.
Yeah.
So bizarre. I'm talking to you from Jaffa, and this was Rocket Alley. Every rocket that went into the alley went over this apartment, and I felt safer here than I did in New York.
I'd rather, I'll take my chances with the rockets, just spare me the Valley Asti.
Believe me. And I don't even have a rational explanation for it. These people are firing things at you that can kill you. But go ahead, please. I'm sorry, interrupting.
Energetic. No, it's I don't know exactly how it's going to pan out, but it's kind of writing me, which is a rare experience in my time as a writer. And I'm just trying to keep up, and I will hand it over when I'm ready.
Lakasha, please.
I feel personally that the biggest challenge for me, I couldn't write in the first few months, and now I'm starting writing again. And I think the weirdest thing that never happened to me as a writer is I don't know where to locate my stories. Like all my stories so far were in Israel. But in a sense, I feel that after October 7, being here in New York, there's something I can't fully describe or explain about being in Israel after October 7th. And then again, I don't feel that I'm enough time in New York to write a story about New York. So it's the weirdest thing. I'm writing now a story with no location in a sense. And I think it's very much something that I feel also like as somebody in the world that is very connected to Israel. My heart is definitely in Israel. And then again, physically, I'm here in New York right now. And I think another thing that like changed about the perspective of the themes and ideas, and it's really like I think what happened on October 7 is an Israeli story and it's a Jewish story, but it's also just something that every human can relate and understand. Questions about meaning and about history and about things repeating themselves. I don't know. It's like a lot of the things I heard here after October 7 from the Jewish community is it's a pogrom. It's like really people have memories of things they didn't experience but yet felt them. And I think these are ideas that are very unique in the Jewish experience, but are also you can find it at any culture and every society. So I think really for me, understanding how to connect between this very Jewish experience to something more universal, I think would be the challenge now.
I'd only say just in response, in diplomacy, we say that no comment is also a comment. And to extrapolate that, a story that has no location also has a location.
Right.
It definitely
That's
has
a good-
location. And
that's
basically,
good.
we're all in that same location right now. Aviya,
Right.
please.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't know about starting something new right now. I just think that would be very, very challenging. I'm glad I was deep in a book about Ibn Ezra, and I really enjoyed going to the far past and to prior crises in Jewish history. In a weird way, that was comforting. I don't know if I could have started right now. I think we've really been through a sort of a double tragedy and a double shock. To me, it's not just October 7th, but the reaction of the world. And the reaction of the world has just that I certainly was aware of anti-Semitism and aware of anti-Semitism in the literary community. I'll just mention that because we're all writers. But I think the depth of it has really been the depth and breadth of it has really been just unbelievable. And so I can tell you my response to that has come in teaching. I thought about it and I realized that Jewish writers are not taught. And so I have been teaching all of my classes right now have 50% Jewish writers for the first time ever. And I'm teaching Jewish writers from the far past and just seeing how it goes. But I think it's a tragedy that, great Jewish writers like I.B. Singer aren't part of creative writing programs ever at all. And I have multiple degrees in creative, like ever. Amos Oz never taught. So I'm trying some of those just to see how things are going. Yeah, and I'm get to teach a Mati Friedman book. It's part of structure, and just see how that goes. So that has been my response, is to be a little, just to think about the Jewish world and Israel in my teaching, even though it's not something that really fits with the population of where I teach. But I just think it's a little ridiculous to be in all of these conversations about diversity all the time, and there's zero Jewish literature that's taught. So I guess part of my response has been in the classroom, and it's really kind of amazing to see how I.B. Singer writes about Israel, even before the state, and how that comes through now, and just to reread all of that now. So that's something that I've been doing, has been reading older Jewish writers, and I guess using them as companions at this tough moment.
So now I want to ask you a harder question. We now
Sure.
discussed how October 7th changed us as writers.
Yeah.
How does October 7th change us as readers? So here personally, Iddo, I couldn't read your short stories except through the prism of October 7th. It's almost as if you wrote those stories on October 6th.
Yeah.
That's what I felt. And
Yeah.
the future, the impending future, is casting already a shadow over all these short stories, impossibly, but retroactively.
Yeah.
Does it change the way we read also?
Yeah.
Does it change the way, Aviya, does it change the way we read I.B. Singer? Does it change the way we read Philip Roth?
I think so, actually. I do think so. And I think that some of what I.B. Singer was describing of, just in his words, Gentiles who can be trusted, sort of a Gentile woman with qualities that made her trustworthy. I think everyone is thinking, what makes people trust, who can I trust, right? And you realize that that's been
How do we
a
read
long.
the plot against America today? Do we
Yeah.
read it in the same way that when it came out 20 years ago?
That's a great, Elisa, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I was thinking more American pastoral. I see a lot of acquaintances with kids in their older teens and 20s, some of whom have a Jewish parent or grandparent that they know of, some of whom don't, but that to be a young white Gentile, you know, in upstate New York, who's really enraptured with the rhyming scheme of "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And it's like, I've found my identity now. Like that, there's something American pastoral in that for me.
Certainly, but on a grand scale.
Yeah,
On a
yeah. I mean,
grand scale.
you
But
can't
that
make
was,
this up.
that
You
was
could
one
not
that was one daughter. Now it's everybody's daughter.
Right. And it's stranger than fiction. I mean, there's a comic irony buried within the shock and grief and rage and disbelief of what we're seeing. That, you know, I think even Mr. Roth would be surprised.
Yeah.
Right. Sure. You do.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think like a month after October 7, I just tried to see for the first time something on Netflix, and it was about a hostage situation, and I just stopped the movie at that moment. Like
Yeah.
Right.
it became from like the theoretical questions of ethics, and it just became reality. And like I can't think about the idea that like we'll celebrate Passover and we'll celebrate the idea of freedom, and there are people who are not free and are still hostages in Gaza. And again, this is something that like shapes deeply every interaction I have with every person, every book I read, and I don't know. I'm curious how it will evolve over time. And like somebody asked me like a question, an Israeli friend, like, when do you think one day somebody could ask you how are you, like "Ma shlomcha" in Hebrew, and the question will be great, and that will be the answer. Like the answer will be great, and that's it. And like I can't imagine that world now. And
We
I
say
don't know.
great given the circumstances.
Yeah, exactly.
It's qualifying.
Yeah,
You know, I'm fine, but everything else is not fine.
exactly. It's always like
It
this
could be
complex
worse.
answer.
It
Yeah.
could be worse.
I'm not
right.
sure about that, but okay.
I'm
not
yeah,
sure
I
about
don't-
that.
I hope we'll
Yeah.
be in a panel a few years from now and like we'll
Right.
have different answers.
Right.
So-
I
Go
found
ahead,
a couple
sorry.
good books to read. Colin McCann has a novel from 2020 called A Paragon, which
Mm.
is the name of a shape with infinite sides so that it resembles a circle. And it's based on the story of a true story, Palestinian man and Israeli man who both lose their daughters and work together to speak globally on peace and reconciliation. That novel I found very helpful. That was the first thing I could read. And then I also just want to plug this one. It's by a French rabbi. It's coming
Ooh.
out in English. It's already in French, but this is very beautiful. It was written before October 7th, but the first piece in it
What's it about?
death of Elsa Kayat, the psychoanalyst, the Sephardic French psychoanalyst murdered in the Charlie Hebdo attack in 2015. Anyway, so I think slowly the reading is coming back for me.
You know, for me, one of the hardest things about writing is loneliness.
That's right.
If I'm actually writing, I'll get up from my desk after 12 hours and realize I had not talked to another human being for an entire day. And I think there's only one loneliness that outdoes that of a long distance writer, and that's of the person who's actually writing the loneliness of the long distance writer. Our loneliness has been reinforced on a global scale, and loneliness has always been a sort of a Jewish tradition. Sometimes viewed as a curse, sometimes viewed as a blessing. How do we as writers grapple with loneliness?
Great question.
Why are you smiling, Lisa?
Because I find reprieve from the loneliness in writing. That's the
Ah,
only place I don't feel lonely, oddly enough.
then you have a lot of need for reprieve lately. Do you find that you're writing more, just even what you're writing? Are you
Yeah,
retreating into the writing? Is that the safe place?
yeah, very much. We'll see what the results are, but very much.
I think it's a really good question that
Yeah.
I don't know completely the answer on it. I can just tell in my experience, like what happened to me after October 7, I went to the funeral and came back to New York. And for a month, I just stayed in my apartment, didn't do anything. And after a month, I went to the university, and there's a course I'm taking on statistics. And I didn't do any assignment. I didn't do anything. And the professor came to me in the end of the class, and he's Irish, non-Jewish. And you know, as everything hearing about what's happening in Colombia, I didn't know what to expect coming back. And he sat next to me, and he said, the only thing he said is like, I don't know what you feel. I can only tell you one thing. As a young person in Ireland, I had friends who would go to the kibbutzim in Israel. And my friends would always tell me that the people in the kibbutzim are the nicest people in the world. So for me, it was so heartbreaking to hear what happened on October 7. I can't imagine what it is for you. And for me, having that recognition in my pain was really the best response I could get in that situation. And I think for me, thinking about like trying to write about loneliness and about pain is through that. And in that sense, I think it's also important to say there's also pain also in the Palestinian side and in the humanitarian level. And there are people that have this pain. And I think understanding the pain also is the only way of trying to have a solution in the end of the day. So really, again, also understanding my own pain and talking about it and sharing it to the world. But and I think one of the things I find troubling here is that a lot of the protests are not about the pain and are not about how to recover from the pain. And they're just about taking a stance that I'm not sure will help people from both sides find a way forward.
Yeah, I almost want to ask you, before Aviya goes, can we write about Palestinian pain? And if we did, would anybody listen?
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't think any of us do. But it's it's an issue I grapple with, not just on an artistic level, but on a spiritual level. On a spiritual level.
Yeah.
But,
I'm trying to
spiritual challenge for me.
As a tool, I've been messing around with ChatGPT in the thing that I'm writing and interacting with short essays that I ask ChatGPT to write for me. And one, you know, from all different perspectives and from all different to see sort of what comes out and how we can dispense with cliche, maybe, because I think that that certain words and certain sentences and like a Darwish quote, you know, it's like we see these things over and over, we become numb to them, and it becomes very cliche that like, oh, somebody with XYZ identification markers would reference ABC, and we see these rehashed over and over and over again, and I don't think we can actually exist within them authentically anymore. So how do we bust out, again, language, narratives?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge what Iddo is saying, which was so moving. And Iddo, I want you to know that your Twitter thread about your friend's death moved me so much. It was one of the first things that I read when that happened. I think that some of what is hurting us, and I think contributing to a loneliness, is the absence of acknowledgement of pain. So I think that's step one, just to acknowledge it. And I also, to answer your question, Michael, I actually think that this conversation in the literary world about how you could only write from what your own perspective is very damaging and really the opposite of fiction, certainly, but I would argue all of literature. You know, it's the imagination is really important. But I also think it's especially damaging to Jews, because Jews are one of the smallest groups on earth. And if you as a Jewish writer are only allowed to write about Jews, I think that's incredibly limiting and a huge, huge problem. So my answer to your question is yes, absolutely. As a writer, you should be able to be interested in, first of all, to be interested in other people. That's number one, right? And I think some of what we're seeing is nobody's interested in the Jewish perspective, right? So number one, it's our role to be interested in others' perspectives. Absolutely. I think to acknowledge pain is also part of a writer's job. And I would argue, yes, absolutely. You can imagine another person's perspective. And if you can't, I don't know if you really should sort of I just think it's a key part of what we do is to imagine other perspectives and other people. So that would be my answer.
So gird yourself on that. My last fiction book was about an Irish Catholic policewoman in 1944. And I was going to wear a helmet for having written this, but I must tell you, it was also it is immensely liberating to write
Yeah.
about other people and other
Right.
realities.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm capable now, but
Right.
it was like, oh my God, I don't have to write about Jews. I can write about be something else, and that's part of the freedom. But okay, we're back to this again, and this is really a
Yeah.
discussion about the post October 7th. Aviya, you write in English about Hebrew, right? And
It's
getting
crazy.
English readers to
Yeah.
understand the
Yeah.
impact of the Hebrew language. As I said before in my introduction, it has changed the way I read Hebrew. Okay,
Oh.
that's amazing.
That's beautiful.
And Iddo, you are writing in English in this translation. It's a very good translation
Right.
about an Israeli reality, which is almost. And I keep on trying to imagine an American Jew who has never been, or any American has never been to Israel, reading this book and saying, saying literally, "Vus," what is this book about? The idiom is so intensely Israeli, an 80-year-old grandfather joining the Golani Brigade and the Kumtan and this and the gun and the whole army experience. And this is less a problem, I guess, the challenge for you, Elisa, other than, getting Israelis to understand that American Jewish reality, because Dahlia comes out of this intensely American Jewish reality, which is very Israel related. Her mother's Israeli. She goes to Israel. She's involved with Zionism, but it's very American Jewish. So, how do we speak to one another, and how do we speak to our readers coming from very different perspectives, not just as fiction and nonfiction, but talking about language and identity?
So I just want to start by saying that the most important thing is just having a good translator. And like for me, Daniela Zamir, who translated the stories, and also Dalia Rosenfeld that edited the translation, did an amazing job of just, I don't know, trying as much as possible. And it's not always possible. There's a lot of words and things. Yeah, just one example, like only after I was in the States, I understood that the term exit in startups, meaning that you sell a small company and do an exit and get a lot of money. It's not a known thing in the US, which I was sure it was. So I think for me, one of the things I understood that there's a lot of things I don't know. Like, it sounds crazy, but I was sure that most of the Jewish people in the US know what's Golani, and they don't. So for me, I think one of the things that really just changed my perspective is just talking to readers from the US, from other countries, understanding what are my blind points, and I'm sure I still have a lot of them, but trying to perceive that. I'm not sure it will change my writing completely, but I think it is important to be aware of it. And sometimes I make decisions that I'm not aware of how complicated they are for readers abroad to read. And now I think about it, at least. Maybe I'll still make the decision, but I'm more aware of the process.
Yeah, and Aviya has a great translator, King James, Tinsdale. Who else? What?
I don't know. I also looked at a lot of evangelical, like random, evangelical translations and random translations, Old Catholic translations. I looked at Robert Alter's translation. They're all
I've
kinds.
read them all.
Actually, yeah, I actually think if I can make a recommendation, I think that Jewish readers should check out an evangelical translation of the Tanakh in order to understand the American political conversation. So I recommend that. And you can probably get it for free. Many hotels will have one, right? But take a look at some of the key passages, especially those that mention Israel, and I think it helps understand what's happening. So I'm going to suggest that.
I'm always struggling for a translation of a line I use every day in Hebrew from the book of Job, Od hu medaber v'zeba, okay, which translates roughly, I haven't even gotten past the last piece of crappy news, and now you're hitting me with this crappy news, okay, but it doesn't quite work, right? Od hu medaber v'zeba. Lisa, how do you translate the American Jewish experience in that way too?
I don't know. I kind of feel like
those
that's
of us over here.
That's the translator's problem. And I don't know, I'm mostly monolingual, which is ridiculous and American. Working on my Hebrew always, but but I don't have access to any of my translations. I can't tell how they are, what the quality is. And I tend to want to believe as a reader and a writer that it's the reader's responsibility to do the work
Yeah.
with reasonable translation or with a reasonable, with reasonable prose, to bridge that whatever gap there is. Like that's the kind of the part of the mental leap that you take as a reader. And if you have to sort of skim things that you don't get or that are over your head, like fine, but you put yourself in that slightly uncomfortable position all the time reading, that kind of, that
Yeah.
rehearsal of empathy. And it has to go for voice and language too sometimes.
I get the sense from reading Aviya that you're multilingual. You speak French,
Right. Yeah.
Hebrew, and it comes through, by the way, that you have sensitivity
yes.
to the way different readers read different languages, and that was
Yeah.
appreciated. I wondered, I often wondered reading Jerusalem Beach, Iddo, whether it should have been annotated, right? Little
Same here.
asterisks next to,
Yeah.
chupa, next
Yeah,
to, right? What does this
Yeah.
mean? Because so much of it
Yeah.
was not just lost in translation. That'd be easy, lost in translation. Some things are just simply untranslatable.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the aspects that struck me about God's grammar was just the name Adam, which means
Right.
Adam in English, but it means something
Right.
completely
Right.
different in Hebrew.
Right.
And,
Right.
and you read it, and suddenly you get it, and
Right. Right.
that's not lost in
Right.
translation. That's untranslatable.
Yeah.
I do think that we can work harder on little things to increase the connection between communities. So, for example, if you read Israeli news or you listen, there are a lot of abbreviations for things that make it hard for somebody who isn't from Israel to understand. There's no reason why there can't be, something along the bottom of the screen so people with some Hebrew can follow, I think similarly, I think Iddo has a great point. People who haven't served in the Israeli army are not going to be familiar with what the army is doing, which is something every Israeli understands, ranks or parts of the army. Everyone knows that.
Acronyms are huge.
Acronyms. So it's not
Huge,
abbreviations. Right.
yes.
You're absolutely right.
Acronyms that become verbs, by the way. It's even more
Exactly.
complicated.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to follow. And I think on the flip side, if you grow up in Israel, you might not understand, for example, the movements in the United States. You might not know what Reconstructionist or people have no idea what that is. So it's not that big a deal to provide, a 2-sentence explanation of what things are. So I think that we can do that across the ocean, across the languages to understand each other. I would welcome a cheat sheet on Sahel, right? That would be widely distributed so that people can follow and understand what that means.
It's such a
Acronyms.
challenge. I mean, I've written history where I've quoted, Americans from the 18th century who are difficult to understand today in English, never mind in Hebrew, and getting the sense of the old English into the Hebrew was a real challenge. But I spent a lot of time on it. Huge challenge. So we have anybody else? I'm sorry, because we have a few minutes left, and we want to open it up for questions from our distinguished group viewers from around the world. Adina?
Great. Well, I'm going to start with an easy one because we want to bring everyone together in terms of translation. And Michael, what is chupar, or Iddo, what does chupar mean?
I know the etymology of the word. It comes from mishupar.
Yeah,
Improved.
I think the meaning, like usually chupar is like you get like a small gift or something for doing something.
It's
I
a
don't know.
perk.
I get a chupar for, I don't know, studying for
Chupar's
a test,
perk.
so I get a small candy or something. Like that's how I think about chupar, and you have it a lot in the army, but I don't know, like if somebody could expand more about the context of
It
it.
comes from the verb l'shaper, to improve. Aviya, help me out here.
This is fine. Yeah,
And then it becomes a verb, l'shaper, to give somebody a perk, which doesn't exactly, to perk somebody. Itchapalti. I was perked.
Great.
Okay, please, Adina.
Aviya, you talked about how in your classroom, in your teaching, you added more Jewish writers or authors to your syllabus. What was the reaction, if any, from your students when you did that? Did it create more questions, controversy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was a little nervous about it. I had a very positive experience teaching IB Singer. People really appreciated the beginnings and endings of his pieces, as well as the window into old Poland. I taught in my father's court. That was very positive. I will say that teaching Amos Oz right now, I'm teaching a translation of A Tale of Love and Darkness. That has been harder.
Really?
Yeah, and so it's been interesting
Great
how many
translation.
students find, I'm just quoting, students have said that they're shocked by the military angle and how the Amos Oz as a child is imagining attacking various people. And I tried to say, well, you know, Jerusalem when Amos Oz was a child was a very dangerous place, right? Like I'm trying to give a sense. But you know, so I was like, well, let's think, you know, what's going on in 1945? You know, what's happening in the world? But I will say that that has been more challenging. Also challenging has been students have referred to Amos Oz as a white male heterosexual writer. Has been their complaint, and I'm just giving a sense of what it's like teaching right now. And they have asked why we aren't teaching, why I'm not teaching a writer of color or someone who's LGBTQ. So I have taught elsewhere on the syllabus. I have taught people in those categories, but I think there's a knee-jerk thing going on campus right now that every text has to fall into those categories, and Amos Oz is has been challenging. I'll say that.
I tend to be I don't know if this is helpful,
Yeah.
but when I face that from students, which is regular, I like to say, do you know what IB Singer liked to do with his genitals? Because I don't. It's not on the page. So let's assume that it's, you know, he's somewhere on the spectrum of sexuality and get back to work, you know?
That
And
is a great that
you
is
do that with
a
any
great
author
answer.
from any era.
Hmm.
I will say that I'm anticipating, I'm going to teach Matti Friedman's Pumpkin Flowers. And I asked a former student of mine who grew up in Lebanon to come in and talk about Lebanon and talk about Hezbollah and talk about that. So, and he wants to bring in another piece that he wants to teach. So I think I'm trying to do that, or we're going to do that together. Certainly he knows more about living in Lebanon than I do. And I thought that would be useful to have a dual perspective.
That's great. Iddo, you were making a point, you referenced J.D. Salinger, and a couple people didn't quite understand the point you were making. If you could just clarify it,
Yeah,
because
sure.
it seemed intriguing.
Yeah, sure. There was an experiment in Princeton done by actually an Israeli scholar named Uri Hasson. So you can just Google the name and see it. But he wanted to see how changing a bit of the information you have will change the perspective and the way your brain functions. So he took a specific story by J.D. Salinger, and two groups read exactly the same story, but there was only one specific detail that was different, and that changed completely the difference between the groups. So one group understood the story completely in one sense, and another group understood it in a completely other way. And the interesting fact is that it's beyond just the understanding. The brain functions in a completely different way because of that, or that leads to the different understanding. But it just shows how the small changes in information leads to very different ways that we perceive the world. And I think we need to be aware. I see it with my students now. I'm teaching classes that I have students that are on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. There's just different realities in the way we explore the world, just because I'm not exposed to the facts and information that they are, and they're not exposed to things I am. I think they have a lot of fake information there. But it is something we of course know, but I see it every day.
Thank you. Michael, this one's for you. I remember one of the authors that's on our program now, Elisa, I think it was you, hearkened back to a comment that Michael had made about Hasbara and the role of fiction. Michael, you know, you had talked, I guess, made a comment a couple of years ago about how when making the case for Israel, you don't fight back with facts. You need to fight back with emotion. And I wanted to ask you to comment and elaborate how on that, and what the role of fiction could be in Hasbara, in letting people understand Israel better. What kind of emotions could we get out of writing, out of fiction? How could we use it? How should it be? How could it explain Israel better than facts?
I would say, as someone who, yeah, I'm dealing with public diplomacy all the time, we don't use hasbara. It's kind of an antiquated term, but with public diplomacy is we should never lie. You never lie. Once you lie, you're dead. And one of my best friends, who you know, Adina, I'm not going to mention him. He hates fiction, won't read a word of my fiction because he says fiction is. I only want to read truth. Fiction is lies. And what people don't understand is that fiction is actually the highest form of truth. Is telling you truths that you can't access, through a newspaper or through TikTok or anywhere else. It's a higher form of truth, and it's through fiction that you can convey feelings. And we're in a post-factual world. For generations, Israelis and Israel supporters were fighting, our enemies with books like Myths and Facts about Palestine, Myths and Facts about Israel. Nobody cares anymore. And if any of you have been in a relationship, you know that when a myth meets, when a feeling meets a fact, you know what wins. Okay, I clean the kitchen, but you don't love me anymore. That kind of thing. All right. When a feeling comes up, in fact, the feeling's always going to win. So by going to the higher truth of feelings, we can convey what it feels like to be a lonely Jew today, what it feels like to be in a situation where, frankly, no one remembers the pain of October 7th. No one remembers that we hope, 132 people, not much less, far less people still held hostage in Gaza. To convey that, there's no article in the New York Times that's going to favor that feeling. There's no item on CNN or on 60 Minutes that's going to convey that feeling the way a novel about it would, a short story would be, even a poem about it will be. And yes, I found over the years that I was going for the sources of information to fight Israel's information battle. I was going to the wrong people. I was going to the people on Wall Street and on Madison Avenue. It's all wrong. You've got to go to the poets. And the only way that, to the degree they've been effective, is by going to the poets. And by the way, just last thing is, just remember, this country was created, unlike any other country practically on earth, this country was created by writers. And that Israel is far more than a fact, is actually a flight of imagination. Whether Herzl, Jabotinsky, they're writers. And this country takes writers seriously, much more certainly than America does. And when something happens, people would go to Amos Oz, right? They'd go to Aleph Bet Yoshua. What do you think about this? Not everybody goes to American writers and say, what do you think about this?
I was at the Shai Agnon house on October 5th.
Oh, wow. Next door to my best friends. That's where Jonathan and Nomi live, next to that house. Yes. Adina's a good friend.
Reading Shai Agnon, October 6th, 7th, and 8th was really interesting too, to sort of be transported to a pre-Israel world in which there's a lot of argument about whether we need Israel, as we're cleaning up after pogroms, and then a lot of differences of opinion politically, emotionally, in the nascent Israel. And so it was fortuitous, to have sort of just access that when the world changed. It allowed me briefly to sort of take a longer view, which is helpful whenever possible. Also, there's a Clarice Lispector quote that came up for me. You probably know it. She said, "Thinking is an act, but feeling is a fact."
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Evergreen, that one.
Interesting.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Love it.
There was a lot of talk of pain and its effect on your ability to write. And some people raised the question, I don't know if you could answer this, but I thought it was really interesting, that how long did it take for Israeli authors to write after the Holocaust? What was the impact of that on writing. Can anyone speak to that?
Well, I'm not going to speak to it, but I think about it all the time. I think precisely that question. How long did it take us to write about the Holocaust? Go ahead.
I don't have a general answer. I can just say that my grandfather, who is a Holocaust survivor, wrote a diary during the Holocaust, and specifically in Hebrew, because it was important for him to write in that language. And I think for him, writing through the events of the Holocaust is one of the reasons he, I think, was also able to continue, in a sense, in his life, leave this trauma was part of his life forever, but in a way that he's still functional and can have, in a sense, a normal life after, because the writing for him was a way of restructuring the story and the narrative and getting, in a sense, control over the story. And I think that's what good literature can do, is reclaiming, in a sense, our ability to understand reality in a way we can also shape it and change it.
If anybody is unfamiliar with the Dan Pagis poem, it's very short. It's called Written in Pencil in a Sealed Railway Car. Very, very short poem that speaks powerfully to poetry in the aftermath or in the midst of the Holocaust.
Yeah, I would recommend, I'm just going to put his name in the chat, the Hungarian poet, great Hungarian poet, Hungarian Jewish poet, Miklos Radnóti, who wrote his last poems in a camp as he was being murdered. They're really amazing poems. So certainly, like as Iddo was saying, people were writing during the Holocaust. I think though that many people must have struggled with silence, and you hear that in Appelfeld's work. You know, it's all about silence. And so I think that's another very natural human reaction.
I think it also has to do with it's not just the way people can write about the Holocaust, it's also the readers who are willing to read about the way they read the Holocaust. I mean,
That's right.
Elie Wiesel had to write for an American audience and write about the Holocaust in a certain way. It had to have a redemptive message. Primo Levi
People
wrote
are
for
really
Europeans.
good at heart. People are
really good at heart. Primo Levi had to write to a European audience, which was basically
right.
everything's dark and suicidal. And Aaron Appelfeld had to write to an angry and vengeful audience, the Israeli audience. Appelfeld is an author of anger in so many ways. So it's not just about what you're ready to write, it's also who's ready to read you.
Good point.
I want to conclude with one more question. Can you see yourselves writing about peace now in your fiction? How can peace be a part of your writing now? Can you envision it?
Maybe via the writing. Maybe the writing is a way to seek it. Process, process over product, I guess, is the ethos that I can live with.
I can just say personally, from my experience so far, that the only way of trying to think of a future and a different future is actually going through the pain and exploring it in the most deep sense of it, not running away from it, not making it this like intellectual debate about peace. It has to be very personal, in my experience, very emotional, because again, I think only understanding my own pain and the pain of others is the only way I can think of ever thinking about something else. Because as long as I won't understand my own pain, which I'm still working on, I think for me it will be hard to imagine a different future. So the same goes for like the other side in this conflict, and I think that's a point that's important for me.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you all. We're going to conclude. This was an incredible conversation. Elisa, Aviya, Iddo, thank you for your insights, for just being the outstanding young authors of our time. And I want to say a special thanks to Michael, our dear friend of the National Library of Israel, and of so many of our leaders at the institution. You've been a fan and a friend, and really appreciate your allyship. And of course, thank you to all of you who have joined, who have made the time to be a part of the National Library of Israel community. We appreciate you. We feel honored to bring you these programs, and we invite you to come back for our next program. So thank you all very, very much, and be well.
Thank you, Dina. Good night, everyone. Lala tov.